The thin, cold air at 85,000 feet does not carry sound. On the morning of June 18, 1986, the sky above the Hindu Kush is a deep, sterile indigo. Below, the jagged mountains are silent, a timeless maze of shadows and rock. The war here is a distant, muted rumble, the thud of artillery, the chatter of a distant firefight. It does not penetrate this altitude. Then, a shape. A long, slender, ink-black wing glides impossibly high, a silent spectre painted against the curvature of the earth. It leaves no contrail. Air Force Major Michael G. S. is a systems operator, a component in a machine of exquisite Cold War engineering. His eyes are on sensor screens mapping Soviet communications deep in the heart of Central Asia. The Lockheed TR-1, a direct descendant of the U-2, is performing its mission, to see without being seen. Far below, in the hardened bunkers of the Soviet 40th Army's Air Defense Command, radar operators watch their scopes. A faint, ghostly return flicks at the edge of their screens, at an altitude their manuals say is impossible for a reconnaissance aircraft. They know the silhouette. They have a name for it. Dragon Lady. For years, their interceptors, the swift MiG-23s and the powerful Su-15s, have strained at their operational ceilings, only to watch the black plane hang, serene and untouchable, just above them. It is a recurring insult, a technological taunt written in the sky. But on this day, the rules are about to be rewritten. A new player, unseen, is already climbing. Its afterburners are cold. Its approach is a slow, deliberate ascent into the realm where the air is too thin for most wings to hold. The Dragon Lady is not looking down at it. Not yet. To understand the confrontation brewing in the stratosphere, one must first descend into the brutal, ground-level reality of the Soviet-Afghan War. The conflict began not with a bang, but with a calculated, cynical maneuver in the winter of 1979. On December 24th, as the Kremlin spoke of fraternal assistance, the first transport aircraft laden with airborne troops began landing at Kabul's airport. The subsequent storming of the presidential palace and the assassination of Hafizullah Amin solidified a new puppet government under Babrak Karmal. The Soviet 40th Army had arrived to prop up the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, DRA. Moscow believed it would be a short, sharp operation to secure a friendly communist buffer state. They were catastrophically wrong. The invasion triggered a massive, organic uprising. The Mujahideen, a disparate coalition of Islamic guerrillas, took to the mountains. Their resistance was fueled by deep faith, tribal codes of honor, and a fierce hatred of foreign occupation. This was not a conventional war with front lines. It was a war of ambushes, of supply convoys annihilated in high passes, of remote outposts besieged by an enemy that melted back into the civilian population. Initially, the Soviet military doctrine, honed on the plains of Europe for a massive armoured clash with NATO, proved ill-suited. Their heavy artillery and tank columns were road-bound, vulnerable in the narrow defiles of the Afghan landscape. The Mujahideen's greatest vulnerability, however, was their lack of air cover. The Soviet Union swiftly moved to exploit this, turning the skies into their uncontested domain. The Soviet Air Force, primarily the VVS, Voyeno-Vozdushnya Sily, and Army Aviation, became the 40th Army's primary weapon of intimidation and destruction. Swarms of Mi-24 Hind attack helicopters, flying in predatory pairs or fours, became the iconic symbol of Soviet power. They were flying tanks, providing devastating close air support with rockets, cannon, and later, tube-launched anti-tank guided missiles. For the Mujahideen, the distinct thudding whomp 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 of the Hind's rotors signified impending death from above. To support these helicopters and strike deep into rebel sanctuaries, the Soviets deployed a formidable fleet of fixed-wing aircraft. Heavier strikes were carried out by older workhorses like the Su-17 Fitter, and even long-range bombers like the Tu-16 Badger and Tu-22M Backfire, which would carpet bomb suspected base areas in Pakistan's border regions. This aerial dominance was protected by a layered integrated air defense system, IADS. Protecting major airfields and strategic installations were regiments equipped with the longer-range SA-2 guideline and SA-3 GOA systems, linked by a network of early warning and acquisition radars. High-altitude interception was the domain of fighter regiments flying the MiG-23 Flogger and the potent Su-15 Flagon. operating from bases like Bagram and Shindand. For nearly the first half of the war, this aerial ecosystem faced no credible peer threat. The Mujahideen had no air force. Their anti-aircraft capability was limited to the occasional wildly inaccurate burst from a heavy machine gun or a lucky shot from a captured SA-7, which struggled to hit fast, low-flying jets. Soviet pilots could operate with a sense of impunity, often flying predictable patterns. The war from the sky was a one-sided affair of brutal efficiency. But the very totality of this dominance created a critical blind spot: the stratosphere. Soviet high-altitude air defense was designed to stop high-flying American bombers like the B-52 or the supersonic SR-71 Blackbird. It relied on fast-climbing interceptors and high-altitude SAMs. They were not prepared for a solitary, subsonic, but absurdly high-flying reconnaissance plane that existed in a different aerodynamic realm. And the United States was watching. S military saw the Soviet invasion as a monumental strategic opportunity, a chance to bleed their superpower rival in a protracted Vietnam-style quagmire. President Jimmy Carter initiated the covert aid program, a policy massively expanded under Ronald Reagan. The goal was simple: provide the Mujahideen with the tools to kill Soviets and make the occupation unbearable. This covert pipeline, funneled through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI), began with cash, medical supplies and obsolete weapons. But the intelligence requirement was immense. Washington needed to know everything: Soviet troop dispositions, airfield activities, the effectiveness of their new equipment, and the patterns of their operations. Satellite imagery provided some answers, but satellites are predictable in their orbits. S needed persistent, flexible, high-resolution intelligence, collected in real time over specific areas of interest. The answer was already in their hangars. The Lockheed U-2, the legendary spy plane that had provoked the 1960 Gary Powers incident, had never stopped evolving. By the 1980s, the Dragon Lady had been reborn in a new, even more capable variant, the TR-1A. Outfitted with the Advanced Synthetic Aperture Radar System, ASRs, and other sophisticated signals intelligence SIGINT pods, it could peer deep into Soviet-controlled territory from the relative safety of international airspace, or, as the mission profile demanded, from directly over the battlefield at altitudes no Soviet interceptor could reach. Regular flights commenced from bases like RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus and Osan Air Base in South Korea. They would trace the porous borders of Afghanistan, their sensors reaching hundreds of miles inland. The Soviets knew they were there. Their radars would paint the high, slow-moving target. Scramble orders would echo at fighter bases. MiG-23s and Su-15s would scream skyward, climbing at maximum thrust, their pilots straining against G-forces, watching their altimeters wind upwards. But every time they would hit their service ceiling, around 60,000 feet for the MiG-23 MLD, perhaps 65,000 for a clean Su-15, and stall out, their engines gasping in the thin air. Above them, the black silhouette of the TR-1 would seem to hang motionless, a silent sentinel cataloguing their frustration. It became a ritual of humiliation, a weekly demonstration of a technological gap the Soviet High Command found intolerable. By the mid-1980s, the pressure was building on multiple fronts. Supplied Stinger missile in 1986 was about to shatter the helicopter's reign of terror. In the air, the Dragon Lady's continued freedom to observe was an open wound. The Soviet military-industrial complex had been tasked with finding a solution. They needed an aircraft that could do the impossible: loiter in the thin air above 70,000 feet, possess the radar and weapon systems to engage a small, maneuvering target, and do it all within the desperate time frame of an ongoing, draining war. The race to touch the Dragon Lady was on, and it would hinge on an aircraft whose design was already 2 decades old, waiting for its moment in the sun. The U-2 that flew over Afghanistan was not the same aircraft that Gary Powers piloted. It was the product of 3 decades of clandestine refinement, a testament to Lockheed's Skunk Works and its legendary designer, Kelly Johnson. The original U-2A, first flown in 1955, was a masterpiece of minimalism. A jet-powered glider with wingspan longer than its fuselage, designed to soar where the air could barely support flight. Its mission was photographic intelligence. By the 1980s, the airframe had evolved into the U-2R and its dedicated tactical reconnaissance variant, the TR-1A. The physical changes were subtle but significant: a longer fuselage, more fuel capacity, and vastly improved engines, the General Electric F118, providing greater reliability and thrust at extreme altitudes. But the true transformation was in its sensor suite. The TR-1 was no longer just a camera platform, it was a flying intelligence hub. Its primary tool for the Afghan theatre was signals intelligence, SIGINT. Pods lining its wing-like superpods could vacuum up a vast spectrum of electronic emissions: radio traffic between Soviet ground commanders and their pilots, the faint ping of radar beams from SA-2 sites, the telemetry from test-fired missiles. It could pinpoint the location of command posts and air defense units with terrifying accuracy. Perhaps its most revolutionary system was the Advanced Synthetic Aperture Radar System, ASRs. This side-looking radar could create photographic-quality imagery of the ground, day or night, in any weather, from over 100 miles away. A TR-1 flying along the Pakistani border could map Soviet troop buildups around Kandahar or photograph the runway activity at Bagram Air Base in stunning detail, all while remaining technically outside Afghan airspace. The pilot, clad in a full-pressure suit identical to an astronaut's, was now a systems manager as much as an aviator. His world was a dashboard of glowing screens managing the collection priorities of billions of dollars worth of sensors. The flight was an exercise in physical endurance, up to 10 hours seated in a cramped cockpit, breathing pure oxygen, the curvature of the Earth visible through the small trapezoidal windows. The margin for error was zero. At cruise altitude, the difference between maximum speed and stall speed, the coffin corner, could be a mere 10 knots. But within that razor-thin margin, the Dragon Lady owned the sky. It was a solitary, cerebral form of warfare, reducing the chaos of the Afghan conflict to streams of pristine, actionable data. Every successful mission deepened the Soviets' strategic frustration, making the hunt for a counter not just a tactical objective, but a matter of institutional pride. While the U-2 evolved, its potential hunter had been born in a different era, for a different purpose. In the early 1960s, the sight of the high-flying U-2 and the anticipated threat of the American supersonic B-70 Valkyrie bomber terrified Soviet air defense planners. Their response was not subtlety, but raw, terrifying power. 8 and a massive radar, the RP-25 Smerch Tornado, powerful enough to burn out an enemy's electronic systems. It was not a dogfighter. It was a high-speed, high-altitude interceptor, built to climb fast, fire its large R-40 missiles, and kill bombers. When Soviet defector Viktor Belenko landed a MiG-25 in Japan in 1976, the West discovered its secrets. The airframe was steel, not titanium. Its avionics used vacuum tubes. It was, by Western standards, crude. But it was also incredibly fast and could fly higher than any other fighter in the world, with an operational ceiling officially listed at over 80,000 feet. The Foxbat's reputation was cemented. By the time Soviet forces were mired in Afghanistan, the MiG-25 had undergone significant upgrades. The MiG-25 PD Foxbat E variant featured more powerful R-15BD engines, improved look-down/shoot-down capability with the RP-25M radar, and newer R-40RD-TD missiles. While still a dedicated interceptor, it was also pressed into the reconnaissance role as the MiG-25RB. It was this pedigree that made it the only conceivable candidate for the anti-U-2 mission. Deploying the Foxbat to Afghanistan was a significant logistical and operational decision. It was a complex, maintenance-heavy aircraft requiring specialized support. Its high-speed, high-altitude flight profile burned fuel at a prodigious rate, limiting its loiter time. Crucially, its powerful radar was designed to track large, supersonic bombers. Not a small, slow-moving, subsonic target like the U-2 against the complex ground clutter of mountains. Finding the Dragon Lady would be like trying to spot a stationary mosquito with a searchlight designed for tracking eagles. The Foxbat pilot would have one very fast chance. He would need to get close enough for a visual identification and a missile shot before his fuel ran low or the U-2, alerted, began to maneuver. The hunter would have to become a predator in an environment where the prey had always been untouchable. The duel between the U-2 and its pursuers was not merely one of altitude and speed. It was an invisible, high-stakes battle fought on the electromagnetic spectrum. The Soviet IADS in Afghanistan was a network of radiating nodes, early warning spoon rest and tall king radars scanning the horizon, Fansong fire control radars guiding SA-2 missiles, low-blow radars for the SA-3, and the acquisition radars on the MiG-25 itself. The TR-1's primary defense was its passive sensors. Its Product 203 Defensive Avionics Suite was a sophisticated radar warning receiver, RWR, and electronic support measures, ESM, system. It didn't just tell the pilot he was being painted by radar. It identified the type of radar, whether it was a search radar scanning generally or the much more lethal lock-on of a fire control or interceptor radar, and could often pinpoint its location. This gave the U-2 pilot the ultimate advantage: time and knowledge. He could alter his course, move out of the radar's effective range, or simply continue, confident that the threat below could not physically reach him. For the MiG-25 pilot, the challenge was the inverse. His massive Smerch radar had tremendous power and range, but emitting it was like shouting in a dark room. It announced his presence and his intent long before he could see his target. A savvy U-2 pilot, seeing the distinctive fingerprint of a Foxbat's radar on his RWR, could begin gentle, energy-conserving maneuvers to complicate an intercept solution. The Soviet pilot had to balance the need for radar data to guide him and his missiles against the risk of warning his prey. This electronic cat-and-mouse game was further complicated by the terrain. The Hindu Kush created massive radar shadows and ground clutter. A low-flying object could hide. A high-flying one stood out starkly. But distinguishing a small, non-metallic airframe like the U-2 from background noise at the edge of the radar's performance envelope was a monumental task. The Soviets might know something was there at an impossible altitude, but obtaining a lock required closing the distance dramatically. The entire engagement would be a race against physics and information, where seeing the enemy first did not guarantee you could touch him. The confrontation occurred in a physiological no-man's land. Both the U-2 and MiG-25 pilots operated at the absolute limits of human endurance, but in profoundly different ways. The U-2 pilot's mission was a marathon of isolation and precision. Before flight, he underwent hours of pre-breathing pure oxygen to purge nitrogen from his bloodstream, preventing the bends. His David Clark Company pressure suit was his own personal spacecraft. A single pinhole leak at cruise altitude would mean unconsciousness in seconds, followed by a gruesome death. The act of flying was constant, minute adjustment. The margin between Mach buffet and stall was terrifyingly narrow. There was no autopilot for the delicate landing on the U-2's bicycle landing gear, assisted by a chase car. His war was quiet, cerebral, and fought against monotony and the ever-present spectre of physiological catastrophe. His greatest weapon was patience, his greatest ally, the immense silent sky. The MiG-25 pilot's sortie, by contrast, was a violent sprint. Scrambling to intercept, he would light the afterburners of his twin Tumansky engines, a crushing hand of acceleration pressing him into his seat. The climb to 80,000 feet was a steep, fuel-gulping ascent. At altitude, the world outside his canopy was black. The roar of the engines was distant, muffled by the thin air. He was a hunter, his eyes flicking between the radar scope and the infinite blue, searching for a tiny, dark speck. The pressure was immense, the prestige of the Air Defense Forces, PVO, the frustration of years of failure, and the knowledge that this might be the one brief window to succeed. He had to manage his temperamental engines, watch his fuel state, interpret ambiguous radar returns, and if he got close enough, execute a perfect intercept for a missile shot, all while his body was stressed by G-forces and the latent hypoxia that waited for any suit or cockpit seal failure. He was a blunt instrument, hurled upward with the hope of striking a ghost. In this rarefied arena, technology set the stage, but it was human skill, endurance, and nerve that would determine the outcome. The pilot who best managed the intersection of machine limits and mortal flesh would claim victory in a battle few on the ground would ever see. The chase was not merely a tactical game of aerial cat and mouse. For both superpowers, it carried immense strategic and symbolic weight. For the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, the unmolested flights of the TR-1 were a direct insult to their claim of sovereignty over Afghan airspace and a glaring vulnerability in their otherwise formidable military posture. Every mission the Dragon Lady flew was a live intelligence feed to their enemy, revealing operational patterns, new equipment deployments, and command structures. This intelligence directly enabled the Mujahideen, guiding the targeting for newly arrived Stinger missiles and shaping guerrilla strategy. Stopping the flights was thus a military imperative. But beyond the raw intelligence loss, there was the profound psychological blow. The Soviet soldier in Afghanistan lived in a state of constant, low-grade siege. The high-altitude contempt of the U-2 was a metaphor for the entire war, an advanced, elusive enemy that could observe and influence their misery from a position of safety. Shooting it down would be a massive morale booster for the Soviet troops and the PVO, a tangible demonstration that they could strike back at even the most seemingly untouchable symbols of American power. It would be a propaganda coup to counter the narrative of a stagnant, technologically backward superpower. For the United States, the TR-1 missions were the crown jewel of their intelligence effort in the Afghan theater. They provided a god's-eye view that satellites could not match in timeliness or persistence. The data was priceless for calibrating the covert war, assessing the impact of new weapons systems, and understanding Soviet adaptability. The assumed invulnerability of the platform allowed for aggressive collection profiles. A successful intercept would not just mean the loss of a single aircraft and its pilot, a tragedy in itself, but the catastrophic compromise of a unique intelligence stream. It would force a complete reassessment of collection tactics, potentially blinding a critical asset at a crucial moment in the war. Thus, the stratosphere over Afghanistan became a silent battleground for prestige and information dominance. The Soviets were fighting to close a humiliating gap in their defenses and regain a semblance of control. The Americans were fighting to maintain a silent, omniscient presence that gave their proxy war a decisive edge. The outcome would resonate far beyond the Hindu Kush, sending a message about technological parity and superpower resolve in the final decade of the Cold War. As the MiG-25s deployed to bases like Bagram, the nature of the duel began to evolve. It was no longer a simple matter of scrambling an interceptor when a blip appeared. Both sides engaged in a sophisticated dance of tactics and counter-tactics. The Soviet PVO had to solve a fundamental problem: time. From initial radar detection to a MiG-25 reaching a firing position could take 15 to 20 minutes. The U-2, with its loiter capability, could be dozens of miles away by then. The solution lay in prediction and positioning. Soviet SIGINT units, monitoring the U-2's own emissions and its likely flight patterns from previous missions, began to work on pre-positioning interceptors. The idea was to have a MiG-25 already airborne, cruising at high altitude in a likely patrol area, with its radar off to avoid detection. Ground control would then vector the fighter using data from passive ground-based sensors or low probability of intercept (LPI) radar modes, hoping to bring the Foxbat into a forward quarter, visual range engagement before the U-2's RWR could provide adequate warning. The Americans, undoubtedly aware of the Foxbat's deployment through their own intelligence, adapted in turn. TR-1 missions became less predictable. Flight paths were varied, loiter times over the most sensitive areas were shortened. The use of standoff sensors like the ASARs was maximized to reduce the need to penetrate deeply. Pilots were drilled on emergency descent profiles, though from 85,000 feet, a rapid descent was a dangerous maneuver that could overstress the delicate airframe. The electronic warfare officers monitoring the data links back at command centers became key players, analyzing Soviet radar activity in real time to provide threat updates. This was a battle of wits fought by controllers, analysts, and planners as much as by pilots. The Soviets were trying to turn their high-speed interceptor into an ambush predator. The Americans were trying to turn their predictable reconnaissance platform into an unpredictable ghost. The climax would come down to which side better understood the other's new playbook and which pilot could best execute a plan conceived by minds hundreds of miles away in the moment of supreme physical and mental stress at the edge of space. The thin air would judge their preparations. The morning of June 18, 1986, dawned with the routine tension of a high-stakes reconnaissance mission. A Lockheed TR-1A, call sign and pilot identity, still classified but believed to be operating from a forward location, was on station over eastern Afghanistan. Its mission? To monitor Soviet communications and signals along crucial supply routes near the Pakistani border. The aircraft was performing its slow, graceful orbit at its operational ceiling, a silent, black insect pinned to the deep blue. In the PVO bunker at Bagram Air Base, the radar picture told a familiar, frustrating story. The high-altitude track was there, meandering just beyond the reach of conventional response. But today was not conventional. Today, the plan devised through weeks of analysis and adaptation was in motion. A MiG-25 PD of the Soviet Air Defense Forces was already airborne. It had taken off earlier under the cover of routine patrol activity and had been guided into a strategic holding pattern. Its powerful Smerch radar was in a passive or standby mode. The hunter was climbing slowly, conserving fuel, a shark circling in the depths waiting for the signal to strike. The Soviet ground controllers, fusing data from border radars and signals intelligence, began a careful, calculated vector. They guided the MiG-25 using minimal, low-power communications and data links, aiming to place the Foxbat in a forward quarter intercept position, below and ahead of the U-2's projected flight path. The goal was a visual identification and a gun attack. Missiles like the R-40, designed for large bombers, were a less reliable option against a small maneuvering target, and their launch would require a radar lock that would scream a warning. The cannon, a twin-barrel 23mm GSH-23, was the weapon of choice. It demanded getting close, terrifyingly close. As the MiG-25 pilot, his identity also lost to history, pushed his throttles forward and began a final steep climb. The calculus of the engagement shifted from the strategic to the violently personal. In the TR-1 cockpit, the pilot's RWR suite likely remained quiet or showed only ambiguous distance search radars. The threat, approaching from a disadvantaged position below and likely using a pop-up tactic, might not have been immediately apparent. The Foxbat driver knew he had one chance. He was burning fuel at a phenomenal rate in the thin air. His window for engagement was measured in seconds, leveling off at an altitude later estimated by Western intelligence to be between 75,000 and 80,000 feet. A phenomenal achievement for the heavy interceptor. He would have begun a visual search. Against the black sky, finding a small, dark-colored aircraft is a profound challenge. He was looking for a silhouette, a shimmer of heat, anything. And then he saw it. The long, glider-like wings, the distinct profile of the Dragon Lady, cruising apparently unaware. He would have reported visual contact to ground control. The order would have been clear. He maneuvered his massive aircraft into a firing position. The MiG-25 is not agile, but at these co-altitude conditions, relative motion is slow. He would have had to line up carefully, compensating for the extreme difference in speeds. His own aircraft likely near its minimum controllable speed to avoid stalling, the U-2 cruising in its own narrow envelope. Inside the U-2, the first warning may have been visual, the sudden appearance of a silver-grey shape, the distinctive double tail and huge intakes of a Foxbat materializing out of the blue. Or it may have been the scream of the RWR as the MiG pilot, at the last possible second, switched his radar to a lock-on mode to refine his gun sighting. Alarm lights would have flooded the cockpit. The calm, systematic world of the mission specialist vanished, replaced by the primal adrenaline of a fight for survival. The U-2 pilot's options were desperately limited. He could not outrun the Foxbat. He could not outclimb it. His only hope was to maneuver, to break the radar lock and spoil the gun attack. He would have shoved the control column, trying to drag the fragile airframe into a turn, diving slightly to try to gain airspeed, knowing he was dancing on the edge of a stall. The MiG-25 pilot, fighting his own aircraft's inertia, would have adjusted, trying to hold the Pipper on target for a lethal burst. The distance closed. 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000. Within effective gun range, the Soviet pilot's thumb would have hovered over the trigger. At that moment, the stratospheric duel was decided not by brochures or service ceilings, but by the steady hand of a hunter, the evasive skill of his prey, and the unforgiving laws of physics in a realm never meant for combat. One of them was about to fall from the sky. The crack of the 23mm cannon would have been inaudible in the vacuum-thin air. But the effect was devastatingly tangible. A burst of high-explosive incendiary shells fired from the GSH-23 cannon of the MiG-25 walked across the TR-1's right wing. At that altitude and closure speed, even a short burst represented a storm of metal. The U-2's airframe, built for lightness and lift, not combat damage, was violently compromised. The delicate wing skin, fuel lines and control surfaces were shredded. The aircraft shuddered, a violent convulsion in the serene stratosphere. For the American pilot, the world instantly transformed from a mission profile into an emergency of catastrophic proportions. Warning lights and system failures would have cascaded across his panels. The delicate equilibrium of flight was shattered. The Dragon Lady, mortally wounded, began to lose altitude and stability. The mission was over. Survival was now the only objective. He would have initiated emergency procedures, shutting down fuel lines, activating fire suppression if needed, and preparing for the inevitable. The cockpit of a U-2 is, in essence, an escape capsule. The sequence is brutal but precise. Jettison the canopy, which is ripped away by the slipstream, then fire the ejection seat. At 80,000 feet, this is an ejection into an environment nearly identical to outer space. The temperature is below 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The air pressure is less than 1% of that at sea level. Without his full pressure suit, his blood would boil in seconds. The seat rockets him clear of the stricken aircraft. For a long, terrifying minute, he is a human projectile in freefall, plummeting through the sky where he was once sovereign. He must descend to a breathable altitude around 15,000 feet before his parachute automatically deploys. Below him, his multi-million-dollar aircraft, a pinnacle of Cold War espionage technology, tumbles end over end, breaking apart as it screams into the thicker, unforgiving atmosphere. Its debris would scatter across the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, near the border with Pakistan, a treasure trove of secrets for the Soviet recovery teams already scrambling. The MiG-25 pilot, his fuel gauges nearing critical, would have banked away after the engagement. He would have reported the hit, the breakup, the ejection. A confirmed kill. For the PVO and the 40th Army, it was a moment of immense vindication. They had done the impossible. They had reached up and slapped the Dragon Lady from the sky. The Ghost was now a burning wreck on their ground. On the ground, the downing triggered immediate action. Soviet and DRA forces, likely aided by helicopter-borne Spetsnaz teams, moved quickly to secure the crash site. Their objectives were clear: recover the pilot, alive if possible, and gather every fragment of the aircraft and its sensors. And Allied intelligence. It was a crisis. Search and rescue for the pilot, if he survived, would be an operation of extreme danger and diplomatic impossibility deep inside contested territory. The loss of the aircraft's sensitive compartmented information was a devastating intelligence breach. The pilot's fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of the Cold War. It is believed he survived the ejection and parachute descent. Unconfirmed reports, primarily from Mujahideen sources and later Russian claims, suggest he was captured by Soviet or DRA forces government, and he is listed only as missing/captured from that day. The silence surrounding his fate speaks to the immense sensitivity of the mission and the bitter, unresolved nature of the conflict. He became a casualty in a duel that officially never happened, a pawn in a game played far above the comprehension of the Mujahideen fighters or the Soviet conscripts on the ground. The wreckage, however, was real. Soviet technicians meticulously combed the site. The fragments of the ASAR's system, the SIGINT pods, the airframe with its unique coatings, all of it was boxed and shipped back to the USSR for analysis by design bureaus and the KGB's scientific directorate. The intelligence gain was significant. A first-hand look at American stealth materials, radar-absorbent coatings, sensor capabilities, and electronic warfare techniques. It was a partial payback for the treasure trove of secrets Viktor Belenko had delivered a decade earlier with his MiG-25 defection. The June 18, 1986 incident was not the only engagement. Declassified documents and pilot accounts suggest other, less conclusive intercepts occurred throughout the late 1980s, but this event stands as the definitive turning point. It proved the Dragon Lady's sanctuary was violated. The stratosphere was now a contested battle space. The Soviet air defense forces had finally and dramatically answered the years of technological taunting. The laughter had stopped. A new, more dangerous chapter of the high-altitude Cold War had begun, with profound implications for the conflict raging below and the balance of perception between two superpowers. The immediate aftermath of the shootdown reverberated on three distinct levels: operational, strategic, and human. intelligence community was thrown into crisis management. The confirmed loss of a TR-1 over hostile territory was a worst-case scenario. Emergency reviews of all high-altitude reconnaissance protocols were ordered. Flights over and near Afghanistan were temporarily suspended or pulled back to more conservative profiles, relying even more heavily on standoff sensor use. The assumption of invulnerability was shattered. Pilots were now acutely aware that the MiG-25 and potentially other assets could reach them. The coffin corner was not just an aerodynamic reality, but a potential kill box. For the Soviet 40th Army and the PVO, the event was a massive, if short-lived, propaganda and morale victory. The news was circulated through command channels, celebrated as a triumph of Soviet technology and pilot skill. It demonstrated adaptability and resolve. The wreckage analysis, conducted by teams from the GRU, Main Intelligence Directorate, and KGB, provided a tangible intelligence windfall. Understanding the specific capabilities and limitations of the TR-1's sensors allowed Soviet forces to refine their electronic security measures, changing communication frequencies, employing more disciplined radio silence and masking key installations when they suspected an overflight. The strategic calculus of the covert war shifted subtly. The United States had to weigh the immense intelligence value of the TR-1 missions against the now proven risk of losing another aircraft and pilot and of gifting more technology to the Soviets. This forced a greater reliance on other intelligence sources, human intelligence, a HUMINT, from the Mujahideen, signals intelligence from ground stations in Pakistan, and increasingly the emerging capabilities of the CIA's satellite constellation. The shootdown was a stark reminder that no technological advantage is permanent. On the human level, the fate of the downed pilot cast a long shadow. If captured, he became a significant bargaining chip and a source of immense intelligence value himself. His disappearance remains one of the last unsolved mysteries of the Cold War. For the Soviet MiG-25 pilot and his unit, it was the pinnacle of a career, a combat victory in a supremely challenging environment that would likely have been met with high-state awards and promotion. But it was a victory in a war that was, by 1986, visibly unwinnable on the ground. The broader context of the war now drowned out the significance of the single kill. 1986 was the year the Stinger missile arrived in significant numbers. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for Soviet air operations. The psychological aura of invincibility surrounding the Mi-24 Hind was broken as dozens were shot down. Fixed-wing aircraft had to fly higher and faster, drastically reducing their accuracy. The cost of aerial dominance became prohibitive. The shootdown of the TR-1 proved the Soviets could still reach for the highest threats, but it did nothing to solve the low-altitude, shoulder-fired crisis that was decimating their helicopter fleet and demoralizing their troops. The technological and tactical ripples of the engagement extended far beyond the Afghan theater. In the United States, the incident provided grim, real-world data that fed directly into the development of the next generation of high-altitude, long-endurance HALE reconnaissance platforms. The vulnerability of a manned, slow-moving aircraft even at extreme altitude was underscored. This accelerated interest in unmanned alternatives. The seeds for the classified programs that would eventually yield the RQ-4 Global Hawk were being sown. The future of stratospheric reconnaissance was shifting from the daring, solitary pilot to the persistent, unblinking drone. For the Soviet Union, the success was a fleeting bright spot in a darkening sky. But the Soviet economy was straining under the weight of the war and Reagan's strategic defense initiative. The technological innovation demonstrated in the intercept was an exception, not the rule. The systemic rot within the Soviet military-industrial complex meant it could produce a brilliant, one-off tactical solution, but could not sustainably innovate across the board as its American rival could. Internationally, the incident remained shrouded in secrecy. No official acknowledgement came from Washington. Moscow, for its part, did not loudly trumpet the victory in the international press. To conceal the loss and the nature of the mission, the USSR to avoid drawing more attention to the intense electronic surveillance it was under and to prevent revealing the specific capabilities of its upgraded MiG-25s. It became a secret known to all within intelligence and defense circles, a legendary case study in high-altitude interception. By the time Soviet forces completed their withdrawal in February 1989, the shootdown was a historical footnote in a much larger tragedy. The war had claimed at least 15,000 Soviet lives and over 1 million Afghan ones. The Soviet Union itself had less than 3 years left to exist. The sophisticated aerial duel between the Dragon Lady and the Foxbat was a microcosm of the Cold War itself, a clash of technological ingenuity, human courage, and ideological will, fought in a rarefied domain far removed from the brutal, earthy reality of the conflict it sought to measure. The aftermath was not a clear victory, but a lesson in the transient nature of tactical advantage and the enduring human cost of wars fought by proxy in the shadows. The wreckage of the TR-1 was scavenged, its secrets studied, and then forgotten in the avalanche of history. But it proved that in the thin air at the edge of space, no one could fly with impunity forever. The stratosphere over Afghanistan in the 1980s was more than just an operational altitude. It was a metaphor for Cold War confrontation, a domain of extreme clarity, profound isolation, and lethal competition. The duel between the U-2 and the MiG-25 represents a closing chapter in the era of manned high-altitude espionage and the dedicated interceptor built to stop it. It was a contest of opposites, the Dragon Lady, a product of clandestine innovation and finesse, designed to see and not be seen. The Foxbat, a brute force instrument of state power, built to climb fast and hit hard. One was a scalpel, the other a sledgehammer. That the sledgehammer could, on at least one occasion, be wielded with enough precision to strike the scalpel is a testament to Soviet adaptation and pilot skill. It shattered the myth of absolute sanctuary. Yet, the reflection reveals a deeper truth. This technological clash, for all its sophistication, had little bearing on the war's ultimate outcome. While intelligence from the TR-1 helped guide the Mujahideen, it was the low-tech, ubiquitous Stinger, a weapon any fighter could carry, that fundamentally altered the battlefield's calculus. The high-altitude victory could not compensate for the low-altitude defeat. The Soviets could touch the ceiling, but they could not control the ground. Historically, the engagement marks a pivot. It signaled the end of the U-2's unchallenged dominance and foreshadowed the rise of the unmanned aerial vehicle as the primary tool of persistent surveillance. It was one of the last times a dedicated, super-fast, high-altitude interceptor would claim a kill, a mission profile made obsolete by the end of the Cold War. Both aircraft, the U-2 and MiG-25, became legends of their era, machines pushed to their absolute limits in the silent, cold expanse where the blue sky fades to black. Today, the legacy of that duel lives on in the unseen contests that continue above conflict zones. The principles remain: the hunger for intelligence, the drive to deny it, and the endless innovation to see first and strike decisively. The pilots, one missing, one unnamed, remind us that behind every technological marvel is human courage and vulnerability. They ventured into a realm unfit for life, locked in a silent battle that would leave one aircraft scattered across a mountainside and both superpowers with a sobering lesson: that in the relentless pursuit of advantage, even the highest ceilings can and will be challenged.